Hey everyone, my name is Tyler Mowry, and welcome to episode 55 of the Writer's Mind podcast. All right, welcome to another episode of the podcast. If you want to listen to episode 56 and all of the even episodes, you can find them on patreon.com/thewritersmind. There's some super cool episodes in there. You may have seen some of the teasers that have been coming out for some of the Patreon episodes on the YouTube channel. And if you're listening to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and haven't gotten those teasers, then check out those teasers on the YouTube channel. So today, what I want to talk about is what Screenwriting Books got wrong at their core. And this is something I was noticing more recently. And this is a sort of a general theory that I have. And not all screenwriting books are this way, but some of the more popular ones have gotten into this particular mistake, and I want to talk about it today. So, one of the things that I've noticed is that film and cinematography as a storytelling medium is different than all of these other different storytelling mediums. And if you look at a novel, right, there are so many possibilities with a novel. You can literally do anything you want to. And because of that, a lot of people talk about how novels have almost a sense of kind of pure story to them, because there are no visuals, there's no audio, there's no extra pieces. It is paper and words, and it is a story. And then when you look at something like film, obviously there's this huge medium that's attached to it, right? There's the visual, there's the audio, there is, and then there's all these other art forms in it. There's costume design, and there's acting, and there's all this stuff. And I think what happened was when films started to get bigger and bigger and bigger, studios in, kind of the golden age of Hollywood in the 60s and 70s and kind of forward, they started really getting into sort of a Joseph Campbell-esque archetype of storytelling, right? There's the guy protagonist, and he has the girl, and there's the main villain, and there's some major set pieces that we go through, and throughout that process, we learn a little bit about this particular character and his struggles, and we go through, and the villain is defeated, and we go home. And then that happened in a lot of films in the 60s, and then when we fast forward to like the 80s, we have like the 80s action heroes, right? Same kind of concept. Big set pieces, action adventure movies. It's the guy, and he goes and gets the girl, and there's the villain, and there's the huge set pieces, and we move forward. And these were huge hits. You have Indiana Jones, and then you have Star Wars in the 70s, and then you have this type of general archetypal story. And this is something that we see in kind of Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is there's an archetype of a main story, and that main story really worked on film. And the reason that it worked on film is because you can put these big set pieces behind this concept. You can make these sort of action adventure films, and that became a huge push, and a ton of people love those movies because if you look at something like Indiana Jones, there's so many fun things you can do. You look at Star Wars, then you come more recent, you look at Gladiator, and then you get into even more recent where you look at a lot of the Marvel films, especially some of the more early Marvel films like Iron Man and Thor and Captain America. A lot of these are very similar within this lane of there's the main guy protagonist, and there's the girl and the villain and the huge set piece, right? And so I think what happens is a lot of times we kind of talk past each other, where some people talk about formulaic movies, and that's kind of what they're talking about, in the sense that what happened was we started looking at those kind of movies, and we're saying, okay, how do we make that movie again and again and again? What is the way that that particular movie works, and how do we beat that out? And so then we have something like Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, where he's beating out a sellable, marketable screenplay. And then this same core concept ends up being in these different genres, comedy, works. You can still have a comedy story work in the same way that you have an action adventure story in this sense, and even thrillers and horror. Like a lot of times they can be running off the same idea of kind of the main protagonist, and he has the girl, and blah blah blah, blah down the line. And so then what happened was we got so in that zone that we lost some of the beauty of more different stories, right? We lost actually being able to make stories that were not about that core archetype, but were stories. Like novels, there are stories, just all types of different stories about all types of different people and all types of different characters. But a lot of those particular novel stories just didn't work as well on film because they weren't as interesting visually to look at. And then you also have an element of actors play into this too, where we want to see beautiful people and strong people and all these sorts of things on the big screen. Therefore, it lends itself to certain things. It's so much cooler to watch a chariot race on film than it is to read about a chariot race in a book. And that is why film began to slant towards this direction in the types of stories that it told. And there's nothing wrong with those types of stories. I mean, they're very fun. But the problem is, what happened is then these screenwriting books started pigeonholing themselves in this kind of archetypal story. And so then we end up with a lot of stories that are just, rehashes of things that we've seen. And then what happens is, another thing is that when people talk about they talk about like letting the character like show you what the story is about and this sort of thing. I think what's happening there a lot of the time is they're writing within this very clear sort of archetypal story, and then any sort of like specifics about the character, what the story can actually be about philosophically, they just sort of let that flow organically and hope they can find it, and that is what the story becomes. And so I think what happened is, and I think part of what I kind of found in regards to philosophical conflict and looking at some stories that break these archetypes, is that films can tell all types of different stories. They don't have to tell, a super archetypal story. They can tell all sorts of stories. However, what people got confused on is they conflated the structure of that archetype, the hero with 1,000 faces archetype, and they took that away and said, oh, we don't do structure like that. And I think that was kind of the key mistake that some of the indie film world made, which is that they abandoned structural momentum, which is just sort of how stories work, and what a stupid thing to do. Really, what they should have done is say, hey, we don't have to tell stories about, the guy who, over the course of the story, becomes a hero and has the girl and there's the villain and the huge set piece. Like, we can do other different things. We can make Sicario, we can make Whiplash, we can make Wind River, we can make some of these other films. And so I think what you see happen is more recently in some of the what I would consider like story art house films that are art house-y or art house-esque, but actually tell an interesting story and aren't about just a vibey concept. Because that is really what happens in the art house world a lot of the times, is rather than tell a good story, they say, oh, we'll just do some sort of, vibey kind of concept. And they say, oh, what if, whatever. What if this fish person lived in New York City, and then we watch a fish person, go get pizza in New York City, and then we're like, what are we doing here? You know what I'm saying? So the point being that the core of how a story works remained the same, but really what people wanted to change was the core idea of not every story had to be about a particular, kind of action hero character going through the huge set piece and, having a girlfriend or whatever. That they could be more interesting than that. And we could actually have real philosophical dilemma around that. I mean, you can see so many films that are this archetype. I mean, The Town, which is a film I love, with Ben Affleck, Jeremy Renner, is this archetype. Drive is even this archetype. And then some of the huge movies today, Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, all of the beginning sort of origin stories of those. Spider-Man is this way. So it's a story that we really like, this sort of main archetypal story, but of course not all stories have to be that way. And so finding the balance, or not finding the balance, but just like understanding that stories exist outside of film. That's the big piece that I want you to take away, is that the reason that I kind of, I looked at stories in a different way, I think the reason that people have resonated with my YouTube channel is that I was kind of saying, hey, story exists outside of filmmaking. Here's how stories work. Now that we have an understanding of how stories work, now let's reapply that to the medium of filmmaking and see how that fits, and see films that actually operate within story, an understanding of a strong story, yet do not follow just the main clear one archetype that we've seen again and again and again. And so, I think that that's why, in regards to marketability, I think Save the Cat's biggest contribution was in the sense of marketability and in the sense of understanding genre convention, not necessarily here's how a core story, here's how a story works at its core, right? And that's what I wanted to do, and which is say, hey, here's how a story works at its core. Now you can decide, do you want to make the novel? Do you want to make a short script? Do you want to make a feature? Do you want to make this a 6-movie series, or franchise, or whatever you want to call it? Now you can do whatever you want once you have an understanding of how a story works no matter what. And so that's just, I think, where a lot of confusion came within screenwriting, is we get distracted by cameras and lights and all of these sorts of things. And that's why I really value the fact that I came from books in the beginning. I came from novels. I came from reading books. I didn't start as a screenwriter. I started as a kid who really liked to read books. And so I was really attaching myself to core story more than interesting visuals or, a particular scene, that sort of thing, even though I do love those things. And so when you are writing and you're trying to figure out how to, write your particular story. So, okay, this is what when I work with people one-on-one, I have found that a lot of people come in with a concept, and then they have the main character, and the main character has a girlfriend or a wife or something, and that they're kind of struggling with, and then they have like their adventure of different scenes, and then that's kind of the story, right? I see that again and again and again, because this is what people watch again and again and again, and it's what they read in screenwriting books. And I've seen people writing thrillers do this. I've seen people writing comedies do this. I've seen all sorts of different stories kind of in this zone, because they don't know how to make characters. They know that, or they think that, okay, a movie concept is what sells, so here's my movie concept, and then I guess I'll just have a guy as a protagonist, and he'll have a girlfriend, and so there'll be like a quote-unquote B story there, and then there'll be like some other supporting characters, and then some cool set pieces, and that's my movie. And that is why most of the stuff that you read, even pro writers write and try to get sold, is just, complete garbage, and it doesn't matter, because the core of story is meaning. The core story is philosophical conflict. The core story is characters in moral, ethical, philosophical dilemmas as expressed by the external action / plot of the movie that then impresses itself on the audience, is what creates empathy, is what creates actual characterization, and all of that stuff. And so that was the great divorce, was that we got so blinded by how to sell a movie, and we got so blinded by cinematography, and we got so blinded by the cost of making these things, that we ended up in this weird situation where people suddenly see, because people knew there was a problem, right? And the whole indie world, the whole like art house people, they know there's a problem, but they don't know what the problem is. So I think what happened was all these people read Blake Snyder and they read Save the Cat and were like, a 15-point story, I don't want to do that. I want to do something different. And it's like, okay, cool. What do you want to do? I will stitch some scenes together in a vibey way and put some interesting music on it nobody's ever heard and put that out. And that's my movie. What does it mean? Whatever you want. And that's not really the way to make a story either. And so then you have to say, okay, well, what is the way to make a story? The way to make a story is having something to say. And how do you have something to say? You have something to say because you want to extrapolate, you want to explain, you want to walk the audience through a particular dilemma about life. What's something about life and living that is a struggle, something that you struggled with? You know, well, have you had a struggle to figure out whether or not what you wanted was worth going after? You know, okay, well, is the sacrifice that it took to get the thing that you wanted, was that worth it? Well, that's kind of just what Whiplash is. It's that discussion. Or should we be able to blur the lines and do bad things if it means that we can get bad people and stop them from hurting other people? That's kind of just what Sicario is about, you know, beginning to end. Is it right or wrong for a man to start to do evil things, or to start a criminal business because he's never felt alive before? And that's kind of what Breaking Bad is about. And so you really want to start with that kind of idea. Like, that's what stories are actually about, and they've always been about that. They've always been about that. They've always been about us trying to use more than simple words to explain an idea on how to live. That's the whole purpose of them. And it's entertaining, but that is a side effect. A story being entertaining is a side effect. It is not the actual reason that stories as a concept exist. People have written stories specifically to be entertaining, and so that was their express purpose. But the reason that the human psyche holds this piece of something, this abstract thing that we all understand and can interpret and work within, which is called story, that exists because there's a meaningful element, because it's us sharing advice. It's us sharing a way to live. It's us extrapolating on a deeper level than just simple words on a struggle that we're having and a question that we might be holding on to, or a lesson that we've learned. And so, like, if you take anything from my podcast, from my YouTube channel, anything at all, the number one thing would be that the world of filmmaking that you grew up in is not necessarily about storytelling. It's about filmmaking. Christopher Nolan is a filmmaker first and foremost before he is a storyteller. Now, Christopher Nolan is also a storyteller. I'm not saying he's not. But he's a filmmaker first, and that's why sometimes he misses. Sometimes he's here to bring you on a ride of a concept. He's an engineer. He makes these little concept boxes for you, and they're crazy, and I love them. But that's what he does. And then his story is, he kind of sprinkles in afterwards. And it's important to kind of see what, that's why I think writers, people that are writers first and then directors later, I think usually end up making better stories, usually, because they're actually trying to tell a story. Ideally, they're actually trying to tell a story. Taylor Sheridan is like this. He was a writer first and a director after he made after a couple of his screenplays were, huge hits. And that's important because it allows you to learn about storytelling. The problem with directing is it's super filmmaking. Directing is filmmaking. And David Fincher, I think, is David Fincher coming from music videos says a lot about what he does. He is a director. He creates the visual images that become scenes that become the movie. But he doesn't write the core story. Why? I think because he knows he needs to leave it to someone else. Because he knows that that's someone else's job. Because he is focused on directing, and that is not the same. Now, of course, there's overlap. Oh, yeah. But get the spirit of what I'm saying. People are... This is why I don't go on Reddit. Get the spirit of what I'm saying here, right? You want to be a storyteller. If the entire film industry blows up tomorrow, you should be able to go, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll write a blog of stories or something on the internet. That should be if that happened, and it shouldn't be that should be simple for you to do, ideally. But I know it's not, but it should be, because your skill as a storyteller should transcend all of these other pieces of screenwriting and filmmaking and directing and blah 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 blah. And the only way it does that is when you understand what the point of a story is, and then you keep the elements in that you need, which is characters, having beliefs, having structural flow and momentum, these pieces, to then make a compelling story. I hope that made sense. And, if you want to see if you want to get just a small taste of the, of kind of my view on this, my ebook, I talk about this a lot, and I talk about kind of what my view is on storytelling and systematic rewriting and this sort of thing. So, if you're not trying to hop into the course, the ebook is a good place to start. I wanted to write an ebook just because, I wanted to, all these screenwriting guys have a book, and I wanted to kind of distill my quick thoughts that were, I think, valuable in a book to that. And because ultimately, if you read that, you ideally will find that you could read that and then write a novel. You could take my screenwriting course and then write a novel, or I've talked to people that are writing novels in my course, and people that are doing graphic novels and these sorts of things. And so story just exists outside of medium. And I think what happened with the art house kids is they got caught up in the filmmaking medium, and they were just like, what other cool things can we put on film? Well, there's a lot of cool things you could put on film. Most of those things don't make it a story, though. So if you want to just do that, great. But I think it would be awesome if we all collectively came together and started making all sorts of interesting stories on film that were not fully archetypal and that kind of thing. So hopefully that makes some sense. I have no idea. Sometimes I have no idea if anything I say on these podcasts actually translates to you guys, but hopefully that does. If you want to listen to episode 56 right now, you can on Patreon, patreon.com/thewritersmind. I'll see you guys next week.